Now, I'll start by saying I put a big old clock right up here in front of me. Somebody said something about a couple weeks ago when I preached, I went over. It wasn't really my fault because it was his baptism that day. I'm going to put it off on something else. But I've got a clock in front of me today. All right? So if I go over, it's the clock's fault now. No. In the early 1960s, many of us were alive during that time, and remember, some of us were not. In the early 1960s, there was what we understood to be the Cold War. It's the Cold War. It's not like I heard somebody interviewed on the street one time saying the Cold War. They just said it was because it was cold. No, it was because the Western nations, the Western Bloc nations, most specifically the United States and Russia, and a lot of those nations were kind of at one another, and there was a lot of tension in the world. There's a clock called the Doomsday Clock that the atomic scientists put out. They published a newsletter and they put the Doomsday Clock, and they said, it got up to a minute to midnight, and midnight is the time when we would be at nuclear war, nuclear holocaust would come upon us. So the 60s were a time of great unrest and upheaval and fear, not unlike a lot of the ways that we feel nowadays about things feeling like they were all upside down and out of joint. And during that time, there was violence in the street, there was protesting and violence in the street. There were people who were fighting for civil rights that they really should have, but that was turning out in a way. But Vietnam was a time that was just so confusing, a war that we were connected into there. And in the midst of that, the president stood up and said that we need to set a goal that in this decade, before this decade is over, that we should go to the moon. Now they're setting a goal for you, right? Now the people who were going to be in charge of that at NASA sort of took a really big, huge, deep breath, because at the time that the president laid out that as a goal for the American people and for NASA, we hadn't really had very many successful launches of rockets in which we could put people up there. So it was a big, huge thing. And so we started out the process of the race to the moon, race to space, the race to the moon. So, as you know, it went through the Mercury, Gemini, and there were problems along the way. And finally got to the Saturn rockets, and we're going to send them up. And they were sending people up to the moon. Now we think of that as a small thing. That's a pretty huge undertaking. As a matter of fact, they went to the moon with less computing power that I have putting a clock up here for me today. Pretty amazing stuff. When they went up and were in orbit around the moon before they started going down to the moon, they were orbiting around, coming from the dark side of the moon and coming into light. And they were coming into dark. Every 90 minutes they would go through darkness and then back out into light. And in one of those revolutions, they were taking a camera out of the window, and you could see across the moon, and it looked like the earth was rising. It looked, we talk about a sunrise, it was like the earth rising up. And I remember being just a kid, they didn't say, "Wow, look what we've done." They said, in the beginning, God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God separated the light from the darkness. So hear me when I tell you that story to tell you this. In the midst of one of the greatest things, only 12 people in all the history of humanity have ever walked on the moon's surface, have ever gone there and walked on the moon's surface. and a great accomplishment. But in the humility of those, and quite frankly, the fighter pilots and the ones who became the astronauts were not known for humility. But I thought it was really pretty awesome as just a kid, remembering hearing them read the words from our scriptures when God said, "Let there be light." Today we listen for, this is at the last of our sermon series. Now, we didn't get to all of the I ams. You know, the vine and all of those things. We didn't get to all of them because we only had 4 Sundays to do it, right, Pastor? So we did the best that we could. But I'll tell you, we got to a great one today when we got to this I am of Jesus. Just as a reminder to you, if you haven't been here to the other parts of it, in John's Gospel, when Jesus says the words I am, in a way he's claiming that he is the God, the very God that we serve. In John's Gospel, it's hard to see a separation between Jesus and God. And so he is there, and it says again, Jesus spoke. Again, that means he'd spoken before, and he'd already been in conversation with these people. Again, Jesus spoke and said, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. I am the light of the world." Does that sound like a familiar? One of the most primary images of our faith, I believe, is light. You know, we have a lot of secondary images in our faith, but one of the most primary things about us as people of faith in God, from the very beginning, is that God is light. Light. Jesus is speaking to the folks, the Pharisees here. He's in the kind of the ending up of his public ministry, where he's teaching in public. His disciples are there with him. They're moving along, but they're having conversations with Pharisees. And in the 7th chapter, the verse comes in and says that it was the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles, depending on which text you're reading. Both of them were talking about the same thing. They're called to the same thing. The Feast of Tabernacles was sort of in John's mind, and keep in mind that John, when he writes more for not for how things happen in real life, but how things happen to reveal the reality of God, the theological reality of who Jesus Christ was and how that connects. And so John tells us it's in the midst of the Feast of Tabernacles, or the Feast of Booths, that Jesus is doing this section of teaching. And you say, wow, that's great. No. Well, listen to what the Feast of Tabernacles is. It was one of 3 of the pilgrim festivals that went on during the year. You had Passover, and then you had Pentecost, and then in the fall of the year, at the time of harvest, you would have the Feast of Tabernacles. And there, what happened was, there was a great festival for 7 days, and they would create these booths or places. It's not unlike, when we went to Rocky's mom, Luann's funeral, we passed by a great area of festival in Ripley, Mississippi. We passed by First Monday. Anybody know what First Monday is? Yeah, so I see some heads shaking. It's sort of like that, where people have these little booths or tabernacles or houses out there where they come together for a festival time. They came together in Jerusalem to celebrate the light of God in their life, in the bounty of the harvest time. And they lit these 4 candle stands, these 4 lamps, in the court of the temple court of women, which is the courtyard that is just one of the first courtyards you come into when you come into the temple, and before you go on up into the area of sacrifice and all that. But there was the courtyard, and on one side of the courtyard was the treasury and all that. And there were 4 big, huge lampstands that they lit during the Feast of Tabernacles. And the Mishnah tells us that the light from these 4 lamps, listen to this, this is technology from Jesus' day. The light from those 4 lamps lit the courtyard of every home in Jerusalem. And so Jesus is speaking during a time when there's light. In the 7th chapter of John, his disciples actually spoke to Jesus in a very imperative way and said, you need to go, get out of here, go there and let people see who you are. And Jesus says, it is not yet my time. And so John is weaving in there the whole idea of the background of light from the Feast of Tabernacles. In the very beginning, as we've already said, God said, let there be light. God also went ahead of the children of Israel in the Exodus, went before them as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That is the Scripture, writer of Genesis' way of telling us that it was God who was the very light for God's people during the night. Moses, when he went up and then he saw this bush that was being burned, that was not being consumed, saw that God was in that fire and in that light. So light has become, in ancient times, in times of ancient Hebrew people, a symbol for who God was. They also, in the wisdom tradition, that light stands for the wisdom of God, enlightening all of us. So the symbolism of John is based on a deep history and a deep tradition of light being something God. It actually starts, the Gospel of John starts. You remember how it starts? In the beginning was the Logos, the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And this Word was the life that was the light to all people. That light shines forth in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So we see that in John's Gospel presents a world where there are 2 choices: to follow Jesus and have the light of life, or to walk in darkness. In Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees, he said, I am the light of the world. I'm the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And then the Pharisees said, oh, that's great. No, they didn't. The Pharisees said, well, you testify on your own behalf. Your testimony is not valid. So Jesus stands in their midst and says, I am the light of the world. And the Pharisees say, boom, invalid. We don't believe you're a good witness, Jesus, is what they were trying to say. As a matter of fact, at the end of this conversation, they were looking, because Jesus says, he said, it says in your law, Jesus talking to the Pharisees, he said, it says in your law that if there are 2 witnesses, then that makes it valid. He said, I testify, I give witness to who I am. And my Father, who in heaven, also testifies. And so what he says is he turns the Pharisees kind of over on the law over against them and says, I am valid. He says, as a matter of fact, he said, I did not come to judge. And I think Jesus said that because, and he also told us not to judge, by the way. But he came not to judge because he understood that was the work of God. But he came to give witness to the light. He came to give witness to the light of God in the world. He said, I give witness and my Father in heaven gives witness. And later on in the part of the text we didn't read, the Pharisees misunderstood it so badly. They were saying, well, who is your Father? Where's your Father? And he said, you neither know me or my Father. Jesus said, I come into the world to bring light into the world. Just previous to this event, when Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and when he says, I don't judge, but if I did judge, I would be valid in my judgment, he said, was the story of the woman who was caught in adultery. And the one, you remember who Jesus said, if you're without sin, cast the first stone. John is talking about a light coming into the world that is a light that brings life. As a matter of fact, the John's Gospel, if you read it, was written that the light of Christ might be revealed, that followers may believe, that we might become followers of Jesus Christ, that we may believe that light and that revealing light. Then listen to just a little bit from chapter 9. I know we all already read it, but listen to this. As he was walking along, he saw a man blind from birth. And you don't remember this story, right? The man who was blind from birth. And his disciples said, who sinned? Was it his mom and dad? Was it him who sinned? And Jesus said, it was neither this man nor his parents who sinned. He was born blind so that God's work might be revealed. Now listen to that. We have our culture, going back to ancient Hebrew times, has a tendency to hang on people who have difficulties in life, and maybe it is a protection mechanism for us to say, oh, that would never happen to them. There must be something that caused this man to be blind. And Jesus says, this man was born blind so that God might be revealed. In the midst of this teaching of Jesus during a festival of light, during a festival of gratitude and thanksgiving for God's light in the world, Jesus comes upon a man who is blind from birth. And then he says, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, for night is coming. Now, when Jesus said we, I'm thinking that he's thinking him and the blind man are working together in that. He and God must work while it is day, must work the works which must be done. And that work is what? Revealing God in the world. That work is revealing God. Now, my dad used to have an old saying, he would wake us up early in the morning when it was time to go work in the fields, in the cotton fields, or go to work. And sometimes he'd get up early in the morning and he'd run that old Ford tractor through the garden where there were potatoes, and there'd be potatoes rolled up on the ground, and we'd have to get up. And his saying was always been, get up, you're burning daylight. And I never knew that he got that from the Scripture. You ever heard that? Get up, you're burning daylight. Jesus said, while it is day. And he says, when I'm in the world, there is light in the world. He said, I have come into the world that there may be light. And while there is light, we need to do these works of God to reveal God in the world. You know, there it is. My Bible got in the way of my notes here. When I look at my notes, it confuses me, so excuse me. The light shines forth in the darkness, and Jesus says, when the light shines forth, What we're to do is do the work of God as that is happening while there is light. The saving work of God in Jesus Christ in the fourth gospel presents a world where there are two choices: to follow Jesus or to walk in darkness. So the Gospel of John asks us the question today: are we to walk in the light or walk in darkness? John's sign of the I am of Jesus, I am being the light of life, is central to theology, and it's core to John, and it's core in the life of we who seek to follow. Light is a primary symbol of our faith. As a matter of fact, we don't have stained glass windows. Someone asked me this just this past week, why we as First United Methodist don't have stained glass windows. I said I really didn't know, but I have a good idea that being built during the Civil War, that lead was at such demand that it was being put into things to shoot at people rather than put into lights, stained glass windows for our church. But churches where there are stained glass, our earlier building that we had, the one that was over there where the synagogue is today, actually had stained glass windows, and we still have some panels of stained glass from the early 1800s that are there. But when I think of stained glass, I grew up in a church where stained glass sort of became a way of God speaking to me. There's a bishop who said that stained glass transfers light. That physical light, it was Bishop Max Stokes, some of you may remember Bishop Stokes. He said, light that is physical light comes forth, and once it hits stained glass, it becomes metaphysical light. Metaphysical meaning light that is more than just light. It becomes the light of Christ in our world. Now that's all heady and theological and all that, but here's what I think it means. I think it means those who gather in the church, whether they're stained glass or not, the light that's coming through the windows in our church represents to us the light of God in the world, coming in and on God's people. God said we must work while there is light. But he also said, if you'll allow me to leave John and go out into Matthew, he said, while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world, but when I leave, you are the light of the world. One of the things about going out into space, and I didn't go, but I watched it on television, is that once you break outside the atmosphere, I've just recently been thinking about this. Once you break outside the atmosphere, you're enveloped in a darkness that is kind of unlike anything you know. I was asking myself the question, why is that today? I said, because once you get outside and move out away from this world, this earth, that is a reflector of light, that light just moves right on along. One of the properties of light is that it is always moving and always active. Jesus' light in our world is coming through and is always active. But once you get back to where there's a lot of surface area for something to reflect. And I guess what I'm trying to say is this. As followers of Jesus Christ, we walk in the light not simply for our own selves, but we walk in the light that we might reflect the light of God into the world, that there might not be darkness. And the question I'll ask us, and you can think about this before we come to our time of response. The question I ask is, are we reflecting Christ in the world? It's all well and good to come in here and hear about that Jesus is the light of the world and say, that sounds good. But the question that comes to us in being a follower of Jesus requires us not only to recognize Christ as the light, but to actually do something about it by following Christ. And the question is this: when people look at you, when people look at us, do they see a reflection of the light of Christ? Do they see a reflection of Jesus in the world? And if the answer is maybe not, then we've still got some work to do while there's light.